Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to welcome you to our new digital Bible class. Obviously, I wish I was there with all of you guys, but because of this present distress and the situation with the coronavirus, what we've got now is an attempt, my first attempt to try to teach Bible class through an online medium, and that's what we're going to be doing this morning. For those of y'all who may have not been in town or who haven't been at Palmetto Church of Christ, where I teach, lately, we've been in the middle of a study of the book of Kings. And the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, is a really exciting sort of section of the Bible. It talks about not just the political history that we might expect when we get into the books of Samuels and Kings, but it also really functions as a prophetic story. That it is, in fact, in the Hebrew Bible, the way that the ancient Jews and maybe recorded and ordered their events. It's in this section of the text called the prophets. In fact, when Jesus talks about the law and the prophets, he's not necessarily talking about what we think about the prophets, right? Like Isaiah and Jeremiah and the minor prophets. Instead, he's largely talking about the former prophets and then the latter prophets. And in that section of the former prophets, we would get books like Kings. Now, where we've been in the past, in our last few Bible classes, is we've been spending a lot of time in the north, in northern Israel, in the line of Ahab. We've been talking a lot about the prophets Elijah and more recently Elisha and all the things that they've been doing. And where we finished off last time in 2 Kings chapter 10 was the story of Jehu's purge. If you remember, Jehu is a new person. That's what he's kind of described as in the Assyrian records, that he is a usurper from the context of what's going on in the king of Israel. He's not a descendant of Ahab, but he is someone God chose to purge the leaven of the Amorites from Israel. And as we turn our gaze towards the south, towards Judah, we recognize that that's really what we are looking for here as well. That what we need, what Judah needs, is their own version of Jehu. They need someone who's going to remove Omri's and Ahab's and Baal's influence from the south. And that's where we're going to pick up in what we're studying then this morning. Now, you also should have your screen share up, and I'm going to be playing the PowerPoint as well, so you don't have to just look at me and the glare coming off the lights into my glasses. But the background to this entire text and everything that's going on really has to do with the influence of Ahab and Jezebel on the text. You remember Jezebel, right? Jezebel, of course, is the wife of Ahab, and she is the daughter of Ethbaal of Tyre, like one of the Phoenician city-states. And the reason that Ethbaal married his daughter off to Ahab, and the reason Omri married his son Ahab off to Jezebel, is because Phoenicia and Israel are both on either side of a newly emergent regional power called Syria, or in your Bibles, especially if you have like a New American Standard Version, then it's going to call it Aram. This is, of course, where modern Syria is, north of Israel, and to the south and a little bit to the east of where Phoenicia is. Now, Phoenicia and Israel had had a long history of relationship, right? David, of course, and Hiram had a relationship when they built the temple. Solomon had a relationship with Hiram as well. So what they do, these powers who have some history with each other, is they have teamed up to try to limit Syria's power. And the way you did that in the ancient world is through a marriage alliance. And that's what's happened here, is they've brought together a marriage alliance for political power. And in the book of Kings, those decisions which are made purely for political power without respect to doing what God wants are always doomed to failure. Think about it. Solomon, of course, gains enormous political power and riches, but God removes the kingdom from him because he seeks out the high places and makes these very same sorts of alliances, that he goes after foreign women, and those going after foreign women makes him and leads him to adopting their gods. And this is exactly what happens here with Ahab, that when he marries Jezebel, he ends up worshiping Baal. Now, Baal is, of course, the main Canaanite god at this point, and a direct competitor to the real and true God of heaven, Yahweh. And what happens then is the story picks up, is there in the midst of their alliance, is that they have a son. In fact, they have several sons, 2 sons and 1 daughter who are going to be really important for the story that we're doing. Their oldest son is Ahaziah. He reigns for a little while in the north. His, of course, younger brother is Joram. Joram is the king in the north who is in power when Jehu comes and purges the throne. That's what we were reading about in Kings last time, our last Bible class. But there's another character, a daughter. And that daughter is Athaliah. And just as Phoenicia and Israel had teamed up to fight against Syria, then Israel and Judah are going to team up through a marriage alliance also to fight against Syria. It's kind of, Syria is this kind of character behind the scenes who really is motivating a lot of the actions of what is going on at the time. And the way, again, that happens is through marriage alliance. So Jehoshaphat, who's the king of Judah during the time of Ahab, they've teamed up, they fought against Syria themselves. That's when Ahab dies, and Jehoshaphat almost does. He marries his son, Jehoram, to Ahab's daughter, Jezebel. Now, some other events have happened, and that is that we can read about there in 2 Chronicles chapter 21. We won't go there, but you can if you want. Is that Joram or Jehoram, who, yes, it's the same name as his, I guess, uncle Joram, king of Israel. He becomes king on the throne, and he is the son of Jehoshaphat. And Chronicles says that although Jehoshaphat has lots of sons, he gave them all presents, but because Jehoram was the firstborn, he gave him the kingdom. And he set up all of his sons so they can rule together in sort of a way. Yes, there can only be one king, but a king needs princes, he needs courtiers, he needs governors, he needs military commanders, he needs all sorts of people like that. But what happens is when Jehoram comes to the throne, he immediately kills off all of his brothers and all of his rivals. He reigns for just a few years until he dies, and his son Ahaziah comes to the throne. And Ahaziah only rules for 1 year. He too is entangled with the Amorites. He goes up to fight against the Syrians with Jehoram or Joram of Judah of Israel, and there he is wounded and killed by Jehu. So we have this kind of specter lying over the whole king of the north and the king of the south, and that's the question of this alliance between Jezebel and Israel, and then between Israel and Judah. And it's a time we can kind of pause and question what's going on with Jehoshaphat. Now, Jehoshaphat's not nearly as an important character in the book of Kings as he is, for example, if we were studying the book of Chronicles, but he's still an enigma in certain ways. And that's because when we read about Jehoshaphat, he's a mostly good king. We read that he does what David does. We read that he himself does not do what his Israeli counterpart does in terms of worshiping Baal. He seeks to establish peace and justice in the land. And this is what the Psalms say is the most important thing for a ruler of the land to do, that if a king wants to have a good kingdom, if he wants God to bless his people, the thing he's got to do first and foremost, more than anything, if he wants to be rich, if he wants to be powerful, if he wants his people to prosper, the thing he should do is seek peace and justice. That's the number one thing, according to Psalms, that a ruler should do if he wants to provide for his people. And Jehoshaphat does that. But, and you can kind of feel that but coming, right? But there's a problem. And that problem that he has is that although he does all of these things well, and although these sorts of things seem to be going well, there are serious issues with his rule. And the most important one of these, by far, is that he does not remove the high places, that he's one of many, many even good Judahite kings who don't do that. but also that he allies with Ahab. And although not removing the high places is a massively dangerous thing that only two of the kings of Judah that we're going to read about in the future, Hezekiah and the Josiah, are going to do, the one that's going to have more immediate consequences is that he allies with Ahab and Ahab's family. That first with Ahab, then with Joram, then with Ahaziah. And these actions have consequences. Because we see immediately, as soon as his son, right? Like if we move back here and see where we were at, that is, as soon as his son came to the throne, Jehoram right here, that what he does is the first thing he does is he kills off all of his brothers. And that's because we're going to find out that he's married to Athaliah, and this is how she works. This is what she does. And so we're going to see already that most of his sons are dead, that that's his legacy that he's leaving behind, is that his sons have died because of his choices, the influence of Jezebel and Athaliah and his own decisions. But we're going to find out once we start reading today that it's not just going to be his sons that are going to be at stake, that his grandsons too, and his great-grandsons are going to be assassinated. In fact, 4 out of the 5 next kings after him are going to die in assassination. And all of this is because he decided that what he needed to do as king of Judah is, rather than trust in God, he needed to seek power. And he made an alliance with Ahab, and he marries his son off to Ahab's daughter, and he joins in Ahab's campaigns and joins in the campaigns of his sons, and this will bring his kingdom down to the dirt. So that kind of a little bit longer of a introduction than normal, just because I wanted to make sure that we kind of have some setup for everything that's going on since it's been so long since we met. But that brings us to where we're going to be reading in 2 Kings chapter 11. And you can either read along with me in your own Bibles, but just for the sake so we've got it all together, in case you don't have your Bible with you, I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version. And notice what he says there in 2 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Now when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal family. But Jehoshaphat, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from the king's sons, who were being put to death, and she placed him and his nurse in a bedroom. In this way they hid him from Athaliah, so that he was not put to death. And he remained with her for 6 years, hidden in the house of the Lord, while Athaliah reigned over the land. So we see here that Athaliah is going to be a woman who's going to be driven by her senses. We're going to see that there's kind of a structure here and what's going on in 2 Kings chapter 11. So the first thing she does is she sees that her son was dead, and immediately she acts as her husband acted. When he saw that he was king, then he destroys all of his rivals to the throne, all of his brothers. And now that she sees her husband is dead, she too is going to destroy all of her rivals in the story. And you know what? This just fits what we've seen in the book of Kings. You know, the book of Kings, more than any other book in the Bible, is filled with vicious mothers. Think about it. In 2 Kings chapter 3, during the reign of Solomon, you remember what happens in that story? We have 2 mothers, one who's rolled over and killed her child, and she seeks to kill the child of the other, and they bring him before Solomon or the king, right? And he's going to cut the baby in half, and the one mother's like, that's fine with me. I mean, that's a vicious mother. Or what about in 2 Kings chapter 6? We also have 2 women with 2 sons coming before the king. But this time it's not that one has rolled over and killed one of her children accidentally. It's that these 2 mothers have colluded together to kill one of their sons and eat him one day during a famine because of the siege, and the next day they're going to kill and eat the other son. Vicious mothers. Even in 2 Kings chapter 2, then what we have, in 1 Kings chapter 2, we see that Bathsheba is a mother who does a similar sort of thing. We'll talk about at the end of class here, that she gets the rivals to her own son's throne killed off. You know, in the prophets, And remember, Kings is a prophetic book. Israel is compared to that sort of a mother who devours her own children. And that is indeed the sort of a picture of the mothers that we have here. We hear a lot about in our culture, whatever you think about it, toxic masculinity. And there's certainly biblical precedent, I think, for that. You just have to read the book of Judges to see how that plays out. But there's toxic femininity as well. And that's what we see here played out in the book of Kings. That these are mothers who act as anti-mothers, not as a mother in Israel, but instead a mother who destroys Israel. And First and Second Kings emphasizes those stories more than anywhere else in the Bible. It also emphasizes these women, these queen mothers, these dowager queens, more than any other text as well. Every queen mother, with the exception of one in Judah, is named explicitly. We have, although no other woman rules a nation like Athaliah here, certainly if you look at Bathsheba and others, they have enormous influence. But here this woman comes, Athaliah shows up, and she kills off many children. And she does the same thing that Jehu did, right? But there's a difference, because Jehu does that to a different person's family, but she's going to do it to her own family. There may be some reason to believe that this is some sort of a child sacrifice ritual, but she's not a Jehu. Oh, she is in certain ways where she's killing off all of these people, but she's also not just a Jehu, but she is a Jezebel. That she is influenced. We're going to see that she is a follower of Baal, and what she is doing is led by Baal, and she has brought Baalism into Judah for the first time, and that is going to cause problems. And here we have this woman who has killed off all of the family, but as tends to happen in these stories, it's hard to get everybody. Someone always gets away. And that's what we have happen here, is that someone gets away. Well, not just gets away, but is rescued. Jehoshaphat is the daughter of King Joram and King Ahaziah. She's a lesser rival to Athaliah. She's not a daughter to Athaliah, but a daughter to one of the other wives of the king. And she steals Joash away. And Joshua acts as a true mother to Israel, that she protects Joash, who's very young. She, as we're going to see at the end of class today, that she acts like Pharaoh's daughter, defying the action and edict of the ruler, not her father, but this time her queen mother. She rescues him, she gets him a nurse, and Joash remains for 6 years hidden in the temple, and all the while Athaliah is ruling in power. And we wonder, okay, if this happens in 6 years, then what's going to happen? Well, we're going to read that something really important is going to happen in the 7th year. So let's read just the next section there in verses 4 through 12. And again, I apologize for my voice. It's still a little froggy, although it's better than it's been in a week. Verse 4, but in the 7th year, Jehoiada sent and brought the captains of the Kerites and the guards, and had them come to him in the house of the Lord. And he made a covenant with them, and he put them under oath in the house of the Lord, and he showed them the king's son. And he commanded them, this is the thing that you should do. 1/3 of you, those who come off duty on the Sabbath and guard the king's house, another third being at the gate of Sur, the third at the gate behind the guards, shall guard the palace. And the 2 divisions of you, which come off duty in force in the Sabbath, and guard the house of the Lord on behalf of the king. They should surround the king, each with their weapons in hand, and whoever approaches the ranks is to be put to death. But with the king when he goes out and when he comes in. The captains did according to all what Jehoida the priest commanded, and they each brought his men who were to go off duty on the Sabbath with those who were to come on duty on the Sabbath, and came to Jehoida the priest. And the priest gave to the captains the spears and the shields that had been King David's, which were in the house of the Lord. And the guards stood, every man with his weapons in his hand, from the south side of the house to the north side of the house, around the altar and the house in behalf of the king. And then he brought out the king's son, and put the crown on his head, and gave him the testimony. And they proclaimed him king, and anointed him, and they clapped their hands, and they said, long live the king. Now, we know something important is going to happen. The 7th year is the Sabbath year. And in the book of the Exodus, every 7 years after something is taken under bondage, it goes free. And by this situation, it's not just a sort of a practical sort of situation where the king is waiting 7 years so that Joash starts resembling the family. Babies kind of look like, babies, right? But by 7, they're going to start looking like somebody. He's going to show off a family resemblance. People are going to believe him. But it's not just that. Is that the 7th year is a time of freedom. It's a time of deliverance from oppression. And here, that's what's going to occur in the Sabbath year, is that the people of Judah are going to be freed from the oppression of Athaliah. That we read that there's this guy named Jehoida. We don't know he's the high priest yet. We'll find out that in just a moment. But he's a loyalist. And he's the first significant priest that we've seen since the time of Solomon. Up to this point, the priests have been lickspittles or priests of foreign gods, and we've seen prophets ruling. But now we have a priest, an important priest, the first priest since the beginning of the book. And he brings out the captains of these mercenary troops. Did you notice what they're called? They're called the Karaites. The Karaites are the Cherethites. These are people from Crete. In the ancient world, the best mercenaries always came from Crete. It's a well-known spot for mercenaries. Their land was really bad, so a lot of times younger sons had to go and find land elsewhere. The Cretans served in the militaries of Pharaoh for a long time. We see they served on David, and they were crucial in the coup d'etat of Solomon over his brother Adonijah in 2 Kings chapter 1. Well, Jehoiada brings these Karaites, these mercenaries, into the temple, and he shows them the king, Joash, who they didn't know or believe, and he formulates a plan. This plan has to do with who is on duty and who is off duty. He makes the soldiers who are off duty, there, instead of rotating and going home, they're going to come to the temple. And the soldiers who are on duty are going to pretend like nothing's wrong, and they're going to stay and they're going to guard the palace so that no one can make an incursion against them. And in verses 9 through 12, he enacts his plan. They do as he suggests. They come and gather at the temple. And this is really important because you notice what happens. They come to the temple because only there can they be armed. It's typical in the ancient Near East that guards would function sort of as policemen, but they only had their, I guess we would call their duty weapons, right? And that is, they're not everybody had swords and shields and spears. That you didn't want all these armed people running around the streets in the ancient world. That's how you get a coup d'etat attempt, right? That's how you get a military overtaking. And we see enough of those right in the north that they don't want this to happen. But the temple has spears and shields and swords. And we read here that these are the ones that David made. And by this note, this is a clue that our inspired author is giving us, is that this is a Davidic revolution, that they're going to reinstate David's throne with David's weapons, and they perform this military uprising. They install Joash as king, and we read, "Long live the king." Well, what's going to happen? We read that Athaliah is going to hear. Now, when Athaliah heard the noise of the guard and of the people, she went into the house of the Lord to the people. And when she looked, there was the king standing by the pillar according to the custom, and the captains and the trumpeters beside the king, and all the people of the land rejoicing and blowing trumpets. And Athaliah tore her clothes, and she cried, "Treason! Treason!" And then Jehoida the priest commanded the captains who were set over the army, "Bring her out between the ranks and put her to death with the sword, and anyone who follows her." For the priest said, "Let her not be put to death in the house of the Lord." So they laid hands on her, and she went through the horses' entrance to the king's house, and there she was put to death. She hears that his king, hears the exaltation and the prayers and the cries and the singing and the trumpets. See how she saw what was going on. She's someone driven by her senses. Now she hears what is going on. This is going to be similar, again, just to kind of key it in the back of your mind. This is what happens with Adonijah. He too thought he was secure in his power until he heard people saying, "Long live the king." And rather than fleeing, she trumps in, thinks that everything is going on, thinks that she can overtake this, but she doesn't realize that she's lost the army and she cannot survive. And she is drug out, as is going to be really important a little bit later in the story, outside of the temple. And she and her followers are put to death. And Jehoiada makes a covenant. This is one of the really neat things about this text. Now, and that is that Jehoiada the priest is still a priest, and he is guiding the events that are going on. Now, Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they should be the Lord's people, and also between the king and the people. And then all the people of the land went to the house of Baal and tore it down. His altars and his images they broke into pieces. And they killed Matan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. And the priests posted watchmen over the house of the Lord. And he took the captains of the Kerites and the guards and all the people of the land. And they brought the king down from the house. And they took his seat on the throne of the kings. And so all of the people of the land rejoiced. And the city was quiet after Athaliah had been put to death with the sword at the king's house. And Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign. Jehoiada makes two covenants here. One, of course, between each of the people, the parties, the people, the king, and the Lord, to serve the Lord, to be their people, not to be the people of Baal, but the people of Yahweh. And he also makes one between the people and the king, that they're going to serve the Davidic king, not some, Amritic interloper. And they also tear down the temple of Baal. And here we see the connection between what's going on here and the connection with Jehu. They tear down the Baal altars. They tear down the Baal images. They tear down the Baal priests. And it's so similar to what Jehu does, but it's a little bit different, right? That the Baal, both remove Baal as their main deity, both destroy Baal's temple, both kill Baal's priests. But Jehu also kills all the worshipers of Baal, and Jehoiada does not. Prophets drove Jehu to do this, but this is a priest doing it. The king was the leader of Israel, but here the leader of Judah is still Jehoiada. Even if the king is Jehoash, no one really thinks a 7-year-old is calling all the shots. But the high places aren't removed. In the north, Jehu never removes the high places, the golden calves of Dan and Bethel. And here, we don't see the high places are removed either. But the mercenaries then escort the king to his throne, and the people rejoice, and the people seem to be excited enough about this. They don't rebel. We read the city is quiet. It was peaceful after the time of Athaliah. And Jehu's coup attempt here is really as good as it gets. It's a combination of priest and a king. This reform is based on Moses' covenant, and it's David's promises. And we seem to have hope here that there may not be, though, a prophet like Moses and a prophet like David, but this is pretty close. Now, there are two things that I want to talk about with this chapter that is going to set us up, I think, not just to discuss what's going on with this chapter, but also to move forward. And after that, we'll just wrap up, and I think we'll do the rest then for next week. And that is that this, if you've been listening kind of with your ears on, as David likes to say, listening on with not just your Old Testament ears, but specifically how this connects to the beginning of the book of Kings, because the beginning of books are really, really important. It's that it reminds us in some ways of a new Exodus. What do I mean by a new Exodus? I mean that this looks a lot like the Exodus. Think about it. How does the Exodus begin? That we have a new king, right, who comes to the throne and doesn't care about God's connections to the previous king had cared about. Well, what do we have here? A new ruler come to the throne from a new dynasty. Although she's married to a son of David, she is not a Davidite herself. And what's her first action? That she tries to control her people by doing what Pharaoh does, right? She kills off all of the boys, all of those people who might be her rivals. But what happens is we read it's not all the boys in Israel that are killed during the time of the Exodus, but Moses is saved. And Moses is saved by whom? By a daughter of the king. Now, there, of course, it's Pharaoh's daughter, but here Jehoshaphat is also a daughter of a king, and she protects him. And just as Moses is raised in the house of a king, then here he too is going to be raised as royalty until the appropriate time to lead his people out. And we have, just as at the beginning of Exodus, and throughout the story of Moses, a combination not just of the whims of life and death, but of kings and leaders and priests, is we have the same thing here, is that the king here is led by Jehoiada the priest. It's like Aaron and Moses, right? Jehoiada and Joash are going to be doing the same sorts of things. And just as Moses comes down from Mount Sinai and destroys the idols of the golden calf, we see Jehoiada's first action is to destroy the altars of Baal. And the question we have, there's a question that is just urging us to ask this in the book of Kings, and that is Joash the new Moses? Is he the new David? I mean, he looks at first like a king like David. We have people putting a son of David on the throne that hadn't been there before. We have all these sorts of things occurring that are new and exciting. It's not just some other king over the throne. We have a priest like Moses, where Jehoiada reminds us the most important priest we've had since the very beginning of the book of Kings. And we've been here before. Remember that we said that Solomon is portrayed like Pharaoh, and that just as Moses flees from Egypt to get away from an evil king who's trying to kill him, Jeroboam flees from the Pharaoh-like Solomon, but he flees to Egypt to get away from the king who's trying to kill him. But how has that happened? What's the outcome? It's that every time it sets us up, we know that we're destined to be disappointed. And here we ask the question, is this a new Exodus? Is this it? Every chapter of Kings has just absolutely dripped with messianic hope. And we wonder, is this it? Is this the answer to the problems that we've been having? Well, we won't be able to find that out until next time. But there's one other thing that I wanted to mention, and just for a moment. And that is that I want to mention that is that this should also remind us of one other story at the very beginning in 1 Kings chapter 1. And that is the story of Solomon's own ascension to the throne. In both here in 2 Kings chapter 11 and 1 Kings chapter 1, it's one of these, what some people call bedroom scenes, where we have a king and a prophet, a man of God and a woman together. Normally the king is the man, the woman is the queen or the queen mother, and the prophet or the priest. So for example, in 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 11 through 27, we have David and Bathsheba and Nathan all together trying to figure out how to make sure that Solomon ends up on the throne instead of the interloper, or who we know as an interloper, Adonijah. We have these a few other times. So for example, in 1 Kings chapter 14, we have Jeroboam's son Abijah and Jeroboam's wife and Ahijah all doing the same thing. Or in 1 Kings chapter 19, we have Ahab and Jezebel and Elijah, the same sorts of things going on about who's going to be the next king, what's going to happen in this line. But it's not just that. It's also, what did we read? That in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 41, Adonijah heard the trumpets and the sound, and they heard someone saying, "Long live the king," and he knows that Solomon has become king. Well, what do we see happen in this chapter? But the same thing there with Athaliah, that she heard the trumpets and heard someone is king, and wonders what all this means. But although on the outside, just like with Jehu, and just like with Athaliah, and just like with Nebuchadnezzar, and just like with all these other worldly kings, it can seem at first like God's will is being subverted. It's not. God's will is being done, even if it's not done in a way that we think is the way it should happen. Just like Jacob's theft of Esau's blessing and birthright accomplished God's will, or just like how the people, the Jews and the Romans who brought Jesus to the cross thought that they were accomplishing their own will, we know that it's all accomplishing God's will. And I think that here in this chapter in Kings, it's particularly important to the first audience of the hearers of the book of Kings. Because remember what we've talked about with them, that they are in exile. They're ruled over by a king that is not their king, a Persian king, right? Or a Babylonian king, depending on when exactly it's written. And these Persian kings, or Babylonian kings, just like Nebuchadnezzar, they had been God's instrument. They ruled by God's fiat, but not for forever. Living in Babylon did not mean that God had been defeated or that God's will was not being done. The inspired author here, the book of Kings, is trying to show that no, God's will may have been temporarily for a usurper and a tyrant, a bloodthirsty individual to bring vengeance on those, even on the house of David, because of their entanglements in sin and idolatry, for becoming like Ahab and Jezebel, for worshiping Baal, for serving idols. It's also, we can tell clear from this chapter, that it is God's will that a son of David rule again. And remember how I said every chapter really of Kings is kind of dripping with this messianic hope? That's what we have here. Is that lying behind this is the first audience, and ourselves should recognize that no matter who reigns in the world of men, God's son, David's son, that we know, of course, is Jesus, will rule forevermore, and that we are just waiting for that to happen. That they have hope because God is ruler over all the nations and in every circumstance. And I think the same is true today. Now look, a lot of us are probably dealing with pretty disrupted lives right now. Maybe we're in self-isolation for ourselves. Maybe we're in self-isolation so we don't give COVID-19 to others. Maybe we don't think it's that bad. Maybe we do. But it's undoubted that people's lives are impacted, and people's that we know their lives are impacted. If you hear the updates from David or from David Tomley about what's going on in Italy, that it's sometimes easy to wonder, is Satan's power, is sin and sickness and death, have they won? But it hasn't. God's heir and David's heir sits on the throne. Jesus reigns, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. That we serve a king who rules, and we wait for him to take his throne and put to death the last enemy, which is death. So I hope that this has been helpful for you. I hope that the situation with, doing this digitally still is valuable for you. I long to meet with you in person again. And in the meantime, look forward to next time. We'll go through chapter 12, and we will finish off what's going on with Joash, maybe start into chapter 13. And I hope that you have a fantastic day and a good Lord's Day, and that everything else goes well for you.